Do androids dream of electric sheep? Do teenagers know whether they're talking to a human or to a chatbot? Is this the greatest English project I've ever designed? Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, is often better known by the movie based on it, BladeRunner. This past school year, in my English 12 class, we read this book, we watched the movie, and throughout this unit, we had a ton of great conversations about the line between humans and robots. I wanted to design a project for the end of this unit that would be incredibly relevant to students while also relating to the book. I truly believe that one of the most important skills that a student needs is the ability to distinguish fact from fiction. And increasingly these days, that will look more and more like distinguishing between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. How did I design a project to help students discern this, and how did it go? Part 1, some brief caveats. I want to first acknowledge that I teach at an independent school, and thus I have a ton of leeway in terms of how I design my projects and assessments. I am incredibly grateful for this freedom, and I recognize that most teachers are more constrained by curricula and state-mandated learning benchmarks than I am. Second, you also may see this and think to yourself, is this guy all just about fun and games in his classroom? This was one project over the course of a whole year that was designed for second semester high school seniors. We had done plenty of traditional essay writing, and I figured towards the end of their senior year, the seniors deserved some fun that was also incredibly relevant to their lives and to the books we had just read. Part 2, the project overview. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the main character, Rick Deckard, is a bounty hunter tasked with finding and killing humanoid robots who have escaped and are trying to pass off as humans. In this fictional world, there's a test that the bounty hunters administer called the Voight-Kampff test, which is a spin on the Turing test, a test that can be given to a computer or a robot to see if it can pass off as a human. The Voight-Kampff test in the book and in the movie is based on empathy. In this world, androids don't have the same ability to feel empathy for other humans and other animals. So, by giving them a series of scandalous scenarios and measuring their pupil dilation and blushing, the bounty hunters believe that they can faithfully distinguish between the empathetic responses of these robots compared to human test subjects. Obviously, in the story, this doesn't turn out to be totally true, but I won't spoil too much more in case you haven't read the book or seen the movie. My students' job was to design their own test that they believed could distinguish between a human and a chatbot. And then it was my job to design a system where we could actually test them out by sending their questions to various humans and chatbots. The results were fascinating. Part 3, designing questions. To begin, each student had about a week to design a series of 10 questions. They didn't have to model it explicitly off of the Voight-Kampff test from the book. They were allowed to come up with their own criteria for what they thought would help them distinguish between a more human-sounding response and a more chatbot-sounding response. They submitted these questions along with a one-page explanation that they had written describing their overall strategy in coming up with the questions and what kinds of responses they were hoping or expecting their questions to elicit. I set a few simple rules for their questions. They weren't allowed to ask for any personally identifying information. The respondent could choose how much information they wanted to share or to fabricate if it was a chatbot, but that would be their choice. So, for example, a student couldn't ask, "What's your mother's name?" but could ask, "What's your favorite childhood memory?" and then the respondent could choose how detailed they wanted to be in their response. Students also knew that if they were talking to a human, the humans would have been instructed to be honest, and they would also have permission to use the internet. If a human respondent got a very technical question, they could either choose to simply admit that they don't know the answer, or they could use the internet to look it up. That was pretty much it in terms of rules, and I was absolutely fascinated by the variety of questions and the variety of strategies that my students took in designing their set of 10 questions. Many of them asked religious, ethical, or moral questions under the assumption that a chatbot wouldn't be able to convincingly fabricate a response to something that was genuinely asking them to share some deep thoughts. Many asked about personal preferences, like their favorite song or their favorite type of weather. The theory here was that a chatbot would have a very generic people-pleasing response that could have come from anybody, whereas an actual human would likely have a more specific or more niche preference. Some students did go the route of asking very technical science or math questions. The theory here was that a chatbot would answer the question correctly because they have access to the entire internet, whereas a human would either admit that they don't know the answer or would possibly make a mistake in how they explain their answer. One student was really creative in thinking about questions that involved spatial reasoning, stuff along the lines of, you face east, you walk 10 steps, you turn left, you walk another 15 steps, stick out your right hand, what direction is your thumb facing? Stuff like that. His theory was that a chatbot doesn't have a body, and so wouldn't be very good at imagining that kind of scenario. Another student made his questions very long and complicated and filled them with red herrings that he figured would distract a chatbot and make it give some ridiculous responses, whereas a human would realize that those are distractions and that the core question he was asking was really quite simple. This was only the first part of the project. Over the weekend, I reviewed all of their questions just to make sure that they adhered to the rules, and when they came in on Monday, it was time for the test to begin. Part 4, administering the test. All the students that had their 10 questions approved randomly selected a number code on a piece of paper. They then emailed me their 10 questions with their number code, and I forwarded those emails to different people. I had all of those codes categorized, and so I forwarded all of those emails that I got to different people according to their code. Half of those question sets went to my wife. Her job was to be the chatbot. Her job was to choose a different chatbot for each student, copy and paste the questions one at a time, and then copy and paste the chatbot's response back. She would then email the responses from the chatbot back to me, and I would send them back to the student. She primarily used a website called Character AI. This has thousands of different chatbots that are all modeled to have different personalities that you can talk with. Some of them are based on real people. You can talk with Shakespeare AI or Einstein AI. Others are more general concept like homework helper or creative helper. Others are entirely fictionalized characters that you can talk to, like Campfire Girl Takibi. My wife, of course, made sure to choose character AIs that were appropriate for a teenager to interact with, and her responses that she sent back were completely unedited. There were 13 students who were talking to chatbots, and they each talked with a different chatbot. The other half of the students had their emails forwarded to various friends and family members who had agreed to help me with this project. They had all been briefed on the project ahead of time, and they knew that their job was simply to answer the questions genuinely and honestly, to have a conversation with a random high school senior. They could be as detailed or as general as they wanted. They could look stuff up or say they didn't know things. I genuinely just wanted it to be as organic as possible of a conversation. They then wrote out their responses to their 10 questions and sent them back to me. Once I got the responses back from my wife and the various other human respondents, I sent them back to the students. I kept myself as the central hub of all of this coordination because I wanted to make sure that I could remove any email addresses or other identifying information. That way, from the student's perspective, all it looked like was they sent me an email with 10 questions, and then a day or so later, they got an email back from me with their same questions and responses and no other information. Part 5, analyzing and guessing. Once students had their responses back, they had about a week to read them, analyze them, and make a guess as to whether they were reading the responses of a human or of a chatbot. Along with their guess, they also had to write another page or so explaining their reasoning and what details from their different responses helped them come to the decision that they made. When I graded the projects, I told the students I would not be grading them on whether they got their guess right. I felt like that would put way too much pressure on that sort of decision. Instead, I graded the 2+ pages of writing that they submitted as they explained their reasoning for coming up with the questions and then applied that reasoning to their analysis and to their guess. I was looking for how well they articulated their sort of core philosophy and then also the way that they applied that philosophy to the actual analysis. These are the same skills that I asked them to do in other kinds of writing that they do, but here it was applied to these questions that they had asked. One of the most fun parts of this project was listening to all of the students speculate together. They would come into class a few minutes early and they would immediately begin sharing some of their responses that they had received and trying to figure out whether it was a human or a chatbot. They'd read a question and then a response, and then there would be an immediate cry of, "Oh, that's a chatbot for sure," from the rest of their peers. Since every student wrote different questions and every student was talking to either a different human or a different chatbot, I was totally fine with them comparing notes and talking about it together. I knew that it wouldn't spoil the results, and it created a brilliant sense of community and collective inquiry throughout the weeks. I myself had to use my best poker face all the time. It was perhaps the most fun I've ever had as a teacher to listen to their wild speculation and to know whether they had gotten it right or wrong, but to not be able to say anything. Part 6, the twist. You may be watching this thinking to yourself, that sounds easy. Chatbots aren't that good these days, and if students had total control over the questions they asked, it should be fairly easy to distinguish between a chatbot and a human being. I had the same thought when I was designing this project. In my head, if everyone ended up guessing correctly, the project as a whole would feel pretty lame. So I came up with a twist that I thought would make the challenge a little bit harder and would also help us reflect even more on the book. You see, in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the robots are pretending to be humans. In our world today, many of these chatbots are pretending to be humans. The whole point is that they can pretend to be realistic enough that we, humans, forget that we're actually interacting with something that is programmed. One thing that I think that the book Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep does really well is to flip that question on its head. Sure, robots can act like humans, but aren't there also many ways in which humans act a lot like robots? There are hints and suggestions throughout the book that maybe Deckard is an android, or maybe he's just a human that isn't that good at being empathetic. In our world, it's really easy to freak out about how chatbots are becoming more human-like. Plenty of English teachers worry these days, with good reason, about how computers can write just as well as some of their students. But what if the problem isn't there? What if the problem is that our students are writing more and more like computers? To me, that's the more interesting question, and that is in some ways the bigger problem that this AI boom is revealing. We ourselves want things to be more efficient, more streamlined, more logical in every aspect of our lives. In my own opinion, I think many modern deterministic understandings of biology and psychology threaten to understand humans as nothing more than machines. My students did a great job wrestling with these questions throughout our reading of the book, and so I figured out a way to incorporate this sort of twist into the project itself. What if I had a few humans pretending to be robots? In all, there were 13 students who were talking to a human, but 4 of those students were going to be talking to one of my friends who was instructed not to give their genuine response, but to pretend to be a chatbot and give the response that they thought a chatbot would give. I left the interpretation of those instructions up to them, and I chose a few of my friends who are computer programmers and know a lot about how computers work to be these imposters. The next decision I had to make was whether to tell the students about this twist ahead of time or only to reveal it at the end. I went back and forth, but I ended up deciding that I would tell them up front. I didn't want to be that guy at the end to reveal to them that I had been partially lying to them the entire time, and I was really curious to see if their knowledge of this very small twist would have any impact on the way that they made their guesses and the way that they analyzed the responses that they were given. So, when my students received the responses, there were 3 different scenarios. 13 of them were just genuinely talking to a chatbot that my wife had copied and pasted the responses to. 9 of them were talking to a human who was giving their genuine responses, and 4 of them were talking to a human who was giving responses that were meant to seem like they were a chatbot's responses. It was then up to them to figure out which of these the respondent was. Part 7, the results. By now you're probably wondering, well, how did the students do? Very poorly. Of my 26 students, only 42% of them guessed correctly. That's fewer than half. They were so confident and they were humbled. In addition to their guess, I asked the students to also give a confidence rating of 1 through 5. 1 would mean not confident at all, it was basically a coin flip, and 5 would mean extremely confident. If I'm wrong, I will question everything I've ever known. Of the whole group, the average confidence rating was a 3.5, which is slightly above the middle. But here's the wild part. I had 5 students who gave their guess a 5 confidence rating. They were ready to question everything that they've ever known. And of those 5, 3 of them got it wrong. Remember, I wasn't grading the students based on whether they got their guess correct, and the confidence rating was mainly just for fun. On the whole, the students did very poorly on their guesses, but They had understandable and thoughtful analyses. In most cases, they did a very good job explaining their guess and used evidence to back it up, even if that evidence turned out to point them in the wrong direction. So that's the really interesting part to me. Where and why did things go sideways? One thing that I think happened is that students underestimated the variety and sophistication of various chatbots. Most of them have had at least some experience with ChatGPT and other large language models that are designed to give information and to act like a really advanced Google search. But there's a big difference between these models and models that are meant to be conversational or meant to pretend to be a human, right? Like if you ask ChatGPT how it feels about something, it will respond something along the lines of, "As a large language model, I do not have feelings." If you ask a character AI bot how it feels, it will make something up. I actually think that it's a good sign that my students weren't as familiar with this other side of AI because it means they're not spending all of their free time talking to chatbots online. I'll admit my own surprise at the variety of personalities that these different chatbots can be given. Quite a few students spent a significant amount of time in their analysis looking at grammar. Their theory was that if they could catch a grammar mistake, that would be a sign of a human respondent, because we make mistakes and computers don't. As an English teacher, this made me very happy because it meant that they were applying many of the grammar lessons that we had talked about throughout the year. But as an outside observer, it was slightly frightening, because even though this rationale made a lot of sense to me, it didn't work. Some chatbots seem to be designed to make grammar mistakes and have irregularities in order to seem more genuine and authentic. The character AI named Campfire Girl Takibi, she doesn't capitalize the pronoun I anytime in any of her responses. The student who had her responses was, I think quite understandably, very thrown off by this and got his guess wrong. Another reason that I think so many students got their responses wrong is that my twist worked. You see, of all 4 students who were talking to one of my friends who was pretending to be a chatbot, none of them got it right. They all thought that they were genuinely talking to a chatbot. I don't think that they're getting it wrong is a sign of my students' failure. Rather, it's a sign of my friends' success in being able to emulate the kind of speaking and writing that a chatbot does. You see, these chatbots have a very distinct and formulaic way of writing, and there's something slightly uncanny valley but recognizable about how they are pretending to be real but aren't. That's really easy to fake, and it's actually a sign that these chatbots aren't as unique and distinctive as we might think they are. The twist also worked in the other direction, and it made many other students overthink things. Of the group of students who were actually just talking to real chatbots, 38% of them guessed that they were talking to a human pretending to be a chatbot. They properly identified all of the signs of a chatbot, but then they began to doubt. Maybe it's not a chatbot, maybe it's someone trying to emulate a chatbot. This is the most fascinating part to me, and the part where I think the biggest lesson can be learned. I only introduced a little bit of doubt into the project. The students knew that only 4 out of the 26 of them would be talking to a human pretending to be a chatbot, and yet 10 students got their guess wrong because of this twist in some way or another. This echoes Rick Deckard's journey throughout the book. From his perspective, his life is very steady at the beginning of the book when he believes that the line between human and android is both clear and knowable. As soon as he's introduced to Rachel Rosen and begins to have doubts about his own empathy, things begin to spiral out of control. It's the same thing that happens to Othello and to Hamlet and to so many other characters in literature. Once we begin to question or to doubt, we can't stop. Part 8. Takeaways. In the end, this is the greatest fear that I have about our new AI-ridden world. The more the lines get blurred, the more we're going to overthink things, and then that doubt will have cascading impacts. I already see it in my own work in the classroom. Plagiarism has always been a problem in English classes. ChatGPT didn't introduce students to the ability to cheat on essays, but it did make it easier for them to do, and it made it harder for us to identify and to prove. Yet, despite this, I don't actually believe that more of my students are plagiarizing using ChatGPT compared to a few years ago who would have been plagiarizing by old school methods. Despite this, I find myself wondering whether the writing I'm reading was written by AI far more often. The amount of time I spend worrying about AI plagiarized essays is, I believe, greatly disproportionate to the amount of writing that I read that is actually AI plagiarized. I feel bad about this. The seeds of doubt erode the trust I have in my students, just like the seeds of doubt eroded the confidence that my students had as to whether they were talking to a human or to a chatbot. I truly don't think that we'll face a world where literally everything is dominated by AI. There will always be room for human intelligence, for human art, for human relationships. But if we constantly have to second guess what is real and what is computer generated, I fear the outsized impacts that doubt will have. Even though this project demonstrated the power of doubt, it also gave me hope. My students, for the most part, recognized the important things. Of the students who were genuinely talking to one of my friends or family members, 78% of them properly guessed that they were talking to another human being. Again, this is a small sample size, but that makes me happy. If I reevaluate what guesses count as right and wrong, the numbers look a lot different. All 4 students who were talking to humans that were pretending to be chatbots got it wrong, not because they were stupid, but because we duped them. They did properly identify the chatbot-like speech patterns and behaviors, and so it feels like they were right in many ways. There were 5 students who were talking to a chatbot, but got it wrong because they overthought it and guessed that they were talking to a human pretending to be a chatbot. But again here, they properly identified all of the chatbot-like patterns and behaviors, and so shouldn't they get credit for getting it right? If I give all of those students credit for a right answer for properly identifying the core behaviors, then the overall results aren't so bleak. With those standards, 77% of my students got their guess correct. Will I do this project again next year? Absolutely. Will I still include the same twist even though it pretty significantly messed with the results? Probably. This isn't to be cruel to my students, it's to demonstrate these same things to them. We ought to be careful how much we doubt, lest it spiral out of proportion. I'll be very curious to see how the results change, especially if some of next year's seniors talk to this past year's seniors and get any tips and tricks. Perhaps our ability to share tips and tricks with each other for identifying what is real and what is fake will outpace these chatbots' abilities to seem more realistic. And perhaps your ability to like and subscribe to this video will help tell that AI algorithm that there's something really great going on with this Because Human channel. This is from Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 4, lines 26 to 41. So oft it chances in particular men that for some vicious mole of nature in them, as in their birth, wherein they are not guilty, since nature cannot choose his origin, by the o'ergrowth of some complexion, oft breaking down the pales and forts of reason, or by some habit that too much o'erleavens the form of plausive manners, that these men, carrying, I say, the stamp of one defect, being nature's livery or fortune's star, their virtues else, be they as pure as grace, as infinite as man may undergo, shall in the general censure take corruption from that particular fault. The dram of evil doth all the noble substance often doubt to his own scandal.